Imagine a king, not the one whom history has immortalized with the title the Great, but his older brother. A man who for years stood on the front lines, wielding his sword against an invasion that threatened to wipe his culture, his faith, and even the very existence of his people from the face of the earth. A king who sacrificed every day of his short reign in battle, dying exhausted, only to see his name gradually relegated to the footnotes of history books. Sounds controversial, doesn't it? How could such a pivotal king have been nearly forgotten? Well, prepare to have your perception of historical heroes turned upside down. We've been taught to glorify the victors, to celebrate the brilliance of those who transformed chaos into order. But what if I told you that the true foundation of England, the bedrock upon which the legendary Alfred the Great built his empire, was built by the sweat, blood, and sacrifice of his brother, Æthelred of Wessex? This isn't just another chapter in history. It's the revelation of a counterintuitive truth, a quick reward for your curiosity. You're about to discover the true cost of a kingdom's survival, and the hero who paid the ultimate price, but who most have never heard of. If this story intrigues you, if you believe that forgotten knowledge deserves to be rescued and spread, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our next dives into the annals of history. And to help us spread this truth even further, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this historical rescue from? Your participation helps spread knowledge and give these heroes the recognition they deserve. In the distant 9th century, the island of Britain was a fragmented mosaic of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each with its own line of kings, its own laws, and its own internal disputes, but united in some ways by the Christian faith and a common culture that had taken deep root since the arrival of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes centuries earlier. What we now know as England was in fact a complex tapestry of power, with kingdoms such as Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and of course Wessex, struggling for hegemony, or at best, for their own sovereignty. Wessex, located in the southwest of the island, gradually emerged as the most prominent and perhaps the best organized of these kingdoms. Its rise was due in large part to a line of strong and strategic kings who managed to consolidate power and expand their borders despite constant threats from within and without. Life in Wessex, like much of Western Europe at the time, was predominantly agrarian. Society was stratified, with the king at the top, followed by the ealdormen, nobles and military leaders, thanes, warriors and small landowners, and then a large population of free and semi-free peasants. The Catholic Church played a central role in daily life, not only as a spiritual institution, but also as a center of political, educational, and cultural power. Monasteries and abbeys were repositories of knowledge, centers of learning, and often prized targets for their accumulated wealth. The Christian faith was the glue that theoretically held these kingdoms together, providing a collective identity in the face of the pagan world. Laws were based on ancient customs, codified and enforced by kings, and justice, though often brutal by modern standards, was a pillar of the social order. Yet this apparent stability was fragile. Anglo-Saxon England lived under the shadow of a growing danger from the sea, the Vikings. For decades, these Norse raiders hailing from the cold lands of Scandinavia had terrorized the coasts of Britain and continental Europe. Their initial attacks were ad hoc, swift, brutal raids on isolated monasteries and coastal villages, where they plundered riches and enslaved people, only to vanish as quickly as they had come. These attacks, though localized, had already instilled deep fear in the Anglo-Saxon population and rulers. The Vikings' hit-and-run tactics, with their nimble ships and fierce warriors, made any effective defense difficult. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, rather than forming a united front, were often at odds, exploiting each other's weaknesses. This made them all the more vulnerable. Mercia, once a dominant power, was in decline, and Northumbria in the north was a land of internal strife. East Anglia, a kingdom further east, was under constant threat from naval incursions. Wessex, under kings such as Æthelwulf and later his sons such as Æthelbald and Æthelbert, had managed to maintain a relative cohesion and military strength, but the tide was about to turn in a way none of them could have foreseen. What was to come would be no more isolated raids but a full-scale invasion. a force so massive that it would be known to history as the Great Heathen Armada. This armada sought not just plunder, but land, conquest, and the establishment of a permanent rule, transforming the political and social landscape of England forever. The stage was set for an epic conflict, in which the survival of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom would hang by a thread. England was on the brink of a violent and irreversible transformation. The year 865 AD marked a dark turning point in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. It was not just another Viking raid, like so many others that had terrorized the coasts and rivers for decades. What landed on the shores of East Anglia that year was not a fleet of marauders in search of quick riches, but an unprecedented, cohesive, and determined military force, which Anglo-Saxon chroniclers would come to call the Myceline here, the Great Heathen Armada, or sometimes the Great Viking Army. Their arrival was a harbinger of terror and destruction on a scale the people of Britain had never before witnessed. It is estimated that this force numbered several thousand warriors, although the exact numbers remain a point of debate among historians, with some sources suggesting hundreds of ships and thousands of men. In any case, it was a massive, cohesive, and determined army, very different from the smaller fleets that had raided before. The main driving force behind this invasion, according to the Norse sagas, was a quest for revenge for the death of Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking warrior who was supposedly captured and killed by Ella, king of Northumbria, who threw him into a pit of snakes. Although the historicity of Ragnar is questionable, and many historians see this motivation as a later romanticization, the idea of revenge certainly served as a powerful catalyst for uniting different Viking chieftains under one banner. The leaders of this coalition were formidable figures: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. Each was a skilled warrior and brutal strategist, with reputations that preceded their fleets. Ivar in particular was known for his cunning and cruelty, and his leadership inspired both terror in his enemies and devotion in his own men. The strategy of the Great Armada was clear and ruthless. No more raids, but conquest. Instead of attacking and retreating, they landed, established fortified bases, and advanced inland, aiming to dismantle the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. Their first major target, after landing in East Anglia, was the Kingdom of Northumbria. Situated in the north of England, Northumbria was, ironically, a rich and culturally advanced kingdom, but weakened by deep internal divisions. At the time, two men, Osbert and Ella, were vying for the throne, plunging the kingdom into civil war. This internal division proved fatal. The Great Army marched north in 866, capitalizing on the Northumbrian chaos. They attacked and captured the city of Eoforwic, modern York, one of the main centers of Northumbria. The fall of Eoforwic was a devastating blow, not only strategically but psychologically. When the two rival kings, Osbert and Ella, attempted to join forces to retake the city in 867, they were crushed by the Vikings. Both men died in battle, and Northumbria was subjugated. Legend, though not entirely historically proven, claims that Ella was captured and subjected to the horrific torture of the Blood Eagle by Ivar, in revenge for the death of his father. Regardless of the veracity of this particular cruelty, the message was clear. The Great Army was not a force to be contained by old tactics. They were conquerors, and their arrival in Northumbria marked the end of that kingdom's independence and the beginning of a new era of Viking rule in England. The terror had just begun. Among the fearsome leaders of the Great Heathen Army, one name stood out for its cunning and cruelty, inspiring terror and fascination in equal measure: Ivar the Boneless. The Norse sagas, which, although rich in detail, must be taken with some historical caution, paint Ivar as a legendary figure, a brilliant military strategist and a ruthless warrior, despite his physical condition. It is said that he suffered from some form of bone weakness, perhaps osteogenesis imperfecta, which prevented him from walking or physically participating in combat like other warriors. However, this physical frailty was compensated for by a sharp mind and an insatiable thirst for power and revenge. His reputation as the cruelest of all Vikings was not unfounded, and reports of his brutality, such as the supposed Blood Eagle ritual performed on Ella of Northumbria, although exaggerated, served to terrify his enemies. Ivar's leadership, alongside his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, was the driving force behind the cohesion and effectiveness of the Great Army. Unlike previous Viking raids, which were often disorganized and motivated by rapid plunder, the Great Army operated with a clear strategy and tactical methods that were innovative for the time. They were not just raiders, but an army of occupation with goals of conquest and settlement. One of the most effective tactics of the Grand Armada was its mobility. Using a vast network of rivers and their light, fast vessels, the longships, they could penetrate deep into enemy territory, bypassing coastal fortresses and surprising inland defenses. Rivers became highways of devastation, allowing the Vikings to quickly move their forces into the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Once ashore, they established fortified camps, known as Viking. These fortifications, often built or adapted from ancient Roman ruins or defensive hills, served as secure bases of operations where they could store loot, rest, and plan the next phase of their campaigns. These bases were nearly impregnable to the Anglo-Saxon forces of the time, who did not have the same experience in sieges and rapid counterattacks. In addition to mobility and fortification, the Vikings employed combat tactics that disrupted Anglo-Saxon defenses. Although the shield wall was a common formation for both sides, the Vikings often used hit-and-run tactics in open field, attacking furiously and then retreating to reorganize, or employing flanking and ambushes. They were masters of psychological warfare, using their reputation for brutality to weaken enemy morale even before a battle. The speed of their attacks and the ferocity of their warriors, who included berserkers, warriors who went into a trance of rage, were shocking to the Anglo-Saxons, who often relied on more static formations and more honorable battles. Ivar's intelligence was also evident in his ability to exploit the internal divisions of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He knew better than anyone how to take advantage of the rivalries between kings and nobles, offering temporary alliances or bribes to weaken the opposition. The case of Northumbria, with its two rival kings, was a clear example of how internal Anglo-Saxon discord opened the door to Viking conquest. The rise of Ivar the Boneless and the implementation of these tactics transformed the nature of warfare in England. It was no longer about defending a few coasts, but about the survival of entire kingdoms. The Great Armada under his leadership sought not just gold and silver, but control of the land, the imposition of their laws, and colonization, altering the fate of the island forever. The terror they spread was as powerful a tool as their swords and axes. After the subjugation of Northumbria in 867, the Great Heathen Army, under the cunning leadership of Ivar the Boneless and his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, turned its hungry gaze southward, settling on the Kingdom of East Anglia. Located in eastern Britain, this kingdom was renowned for its wealth, largely due to its strategic position for trade and its fertile lands. However, its prosperity made it an irresistible target, and at the same time its flat geography and lack of robust natural defenses made it vulnerable to a force as organized and mobile as the Vikings. The year 869 AD was a year of misfortune for East Anglia. The Great Armada, after consolidating their power in Northumbria and spending time in Mercia, imposed a truce and demanded large payments, the Danegeld, turned in full force to the east. They moved quickly, taking advantage of the network of rivers and Roman roads that still existed, and the ability of the East Anglian king, Edmund, to organize an effective defense proved insufficient in the face of the Viking onslaught. Edmund, a pious and devout king who would later be canonized as Saint Edmund, attempted to resist the invasion. Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe him as a just and religious ruler, but his faith and the devotion of his people could not stop the Norse war machine. The Vikings' superiority in numbers and tactics was overwhelming. The ensuing battles were decisive, with the East Anglian forces repeatedly defeated. History, though sometimes entangled with legend, relates that Edmund attempted to negotiate peace to save his people, but the Vikings' terms were unacceptable, demanding not only tribute, but complete submission and the abdication of their faith. Edmund's downfall became one of the most dramatic and regrettable episodes of the invasion. Popular tradition, which has become a legend and a fundamental part of the history and cult of Saint Edmund, claims that he refused to renounce Christ in exchange for his life or his crown. For this refusal, he was martyred by the Vikings, tied to a tree and riddled with arrows and then beheaded. His body, according to legend, was found, and miraculously his head was guarded by a wolf. Regardless of the specific details of his death, the fact remains that King Edmund was brutally murdered by the Vikings, and his death marked the end of East Anglian independence. The conquest of East Anglia had immediate and profound consequences. The kingdom was dismantled, and much of its land was redistributed to Viking warriors, marking the beginning of a process of permanent settlement. This region would eventually become a key part of the Danelaw, the area of England under Danish rule. The fall of East Anglia left Wessex in the southwest as the last major independent Anglo-Saxon stronghold in Britain. The other kingdoms had either been conquered, Northumbria, East Anglia, or had been reduced to client states paying heavy tribute to the Vikings, such as Mercia, which was divided and partly occupied. With East Anglia under control, the Great Armada not only consolidated its conquests, but also gained access to resources and strategic bases even closer to the heart of Wessex. The fall of that kingdom was a grim omen for the future of the Anglo-Saxons, a stark and brutal reminder that the invasion was no temporary phenomenon, but an occupying force that would change the face of the island forever. The next step for the Great Armada, logically, would be to turn its war machine against the last great challenge, the Kingdom of Wessex. Amid the inexorable advance of the Great Heathen Armada, which had engulfed Northumbria and East Anglia, and subjugated Mercia, the crown of Wessex fell upon the shoulders of Æthelred, the third of the 5 sons of King Æthelwulf of Wessex and Queen Osburh. Æthelred ascended the throne in 865 AD upon the death of his elder brother Ethelbert. His accession, however, was not a period of celebration or stability, but rather a moment of immense gravity, for the Viking threat, once distant, now knocked on Wessex's door with unprecedented ferocity. The weight of the crown of Wessex, already considerable in times of peace, became almost unbearable under the shadow of the Great Armada. Æthelred was a young king, but he had already demonstrated courage and leadership before his coronation. He had campaigned under his elder brothers, and was therefore no stranger to the battlefield. However, the scale of the threat he now faced as monarch was of an entirely different magnitude. It was no longer a question of defending the borders against Anglo-Saxon rivals, or containing small Viking raids, but of facing a vast and relentless army determined to extinguish Wessex's independence, and with it, the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon power in Britain. His coronation, probably held at Kingston upon Thames, though exact details are scant, was more an act of necessity and continuity than of pomp. The kingdom needed a strong and decisive leader, and Æthelred, as next in line to the throne, was the natural choice. He inherited not just a kingdom, but an existential crisis. The responsibility of protecting his people, their culture, and their faith from almost certain annihilation fell on his shoulders. His predecessors had worked to consolidate the power of Wessex, but now that legacy was at risk. Æthelred's main challenge was the very existence of the great army. Unlike the kings who preceded him, he could not afford to attack and counterattack on a small scale. The great army was not a force to be contained, but to be faced in all-out war. This required a massive mobilization of resources and men, unprecedented coordination between Thealdormen, nobles and regional administrators, and the bishops, and an unshakable resilience in the face of loss. In addition to the external threat, Æthelred also had to manage internal pressures. Tensions between the nobles, the needs of a terrified people, and the need to maintain unity within his kingdom were constant. Wessex's agriculturally based economy was vulnerable to disruption from war. The levies to pay tribute to the Vikings when negotiated were a heavy burden on the people. However, Æthelred was not alone. He had at his side his younger brother Alfred, who, although still young, already demonstrated a keen intelligence and remarkable potential for military and political leadership. The relationship between the brothers, marked by loyalty and collaboration on the battlefield, would be one of the pillars of Wessex's resistance. The weight of Æthelred's crown was not only a burden, but also a catalyst. It would force him to become a warrior king, a tireless defender of his kingdom, dedicating every day of his short reign to fighting an implacable enemy. The history of Wessex and of all England was now in the hands of a king who had assumed the throne at its darkest hour. At King Æthelred's side, amid the storm that was raging over Wessex, there emerged a figure who, though still in the shadow of his brother, already showed the brightness of an extraordinary future. Alfred, the youngest of the sons of Æthelwulf and Osber. Born around 849 AD, Alfred was considerably younger than his elder brothers who occupied the throne, Æthelbald, Æthelbert, and Æthelred himself. His education, unlike that of his brothers who were prepared for war and rule from an early age, had a strong intellectual and religious bent. The chronicles, especially the biography written by Acer, a Welsh monk and contemporary of Alfred, paint a portrait of a young man with an insatiable thirst for knowledge, who learned to read and appreciate Anglo-Saxon poetry at a time when literacy was rare, even among royalty. However, the brutal circumstances of the Viking invasion did not allow him a life of peaceful scholarship. The need to defend the kingdom quickly drew him to the battlefield. Even before Æthelred ascended the throne, Alfred was already involved in his brother's military campaigns. He had been sent on pilgrimage to Rome twice as a child, which gave him a rare exposure to the outside world and the complexities of papal politics. This experience, although early, may have contributed to his worldview and his understanding of the great forces at play. When Æthelred became king, Alfred was not just a young prince, but his chief advisor and military commander. The relationship between the two brothers was one of remarkable cooperation and loyalty, something not always common in Anglo-Saxon royal families, where power struggles could be brutal. They fought side by side in nearly every major battle against the great heathen army, forming a formidable duo at the head of Wessex. While Æthelred carried the weight of the crown and the ultimate responsibility for decisions, Alfred was the general in the field, often leading troops into direct combat and demonstrating a courage and tactical skill that foreshadowed his future greatness. Alfred's potential was not limited to his military prowess alone. The chronicles suggest that he already possessed a strategic mind, able to see beyond the immediate and plan for the long term. His ability to inspire loyalty and his political acumen, which would later manifest itself in his reform of the laws, education, and defense of the kingdom, must have been evident in his younger years. He was a keen observer, learning from the mistakes and successes of his brother and his Viking enemies. Alfred's presence at Æthelred's side was not only a military asset, but a beacon of hope for the future of Wessex. In a time of constant loss and humiliating defeats by the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the existence of a young prince with such talent and potential was a beacon of light in the darkness. Although history often focuses on Alfred the Great, his education and the experience he gained fighting alongside Æthelred were crucial. It was in this period of intense crisis, under the practical tutelage of war and the leadership of his brother, that Alfred forged the character and skills that would enable him to become the only Anglo-Saxon king to be hailed as the Great. His presence was a vital asset to Æthelred, and the collaboration between the two brothers would be essential to Wessex's survival against the Great Armada. With the fall of East Anglia in 869 AD and the subjugation or division of the kingdoms of Northumbria and Mercia, the great heathen army left no doubt as to its next and final objective: Wessex. The Kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of King Æthelred and his brother Alfred, represented the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon independence in Britain. If Wessex fell, the island would be completely dominated by the Norse invaders, and the Anglo-Saxon culture, faith, and royal bloodlines would be wiped out or assimilated. This sense of imminent threat hung like a dark cloud over every village, every fortified town, and, above all, over the throne of Wessex itself. The Vikings, after consolidating their conquests and enjoying the Danegeld, money paid by kingdoms to secure a truce or prevent attacks, of Mercia, spent the winter of 870 at Thetford, in the newly conquered East Anglia. This geographical proximity to the eastern borders of Wessex was an ominous omen. The movements of the Great Armada were not discreet. It was a gigantic war machine, composed of thousands of warriors, armed and battle-hardened, and accompanied by their ships, which served not only for transport, but as floating fortresses when moored on rivers. Anglo-Saxon intelligence, through scouts and messengers, would have been closely monitoring the Vikings' movements. News of the brutality in Northumbria, the death of Saint Edmund in East Anglia, and the subjugation of Mercia would have spread like wildfire, causing panic and despair. The people of Wessex knew what awaited them. No longer mere plunder, but an all-out invasion aimed at conquering their lands and imposing foreign rule. The winter of 870–871 was a period of palpable tension in Wessex. King Æthelred and Alfred, his brother and chief commander, knew that confrontation was inevitable. They should have been using this time to strengthen their defenses, rally their fyrds, militia armies of free men, and prepare the population for what was to come. The mobilization in Wessex would have been a massive undertaking, involving ealdormen from every province in the kingdom, who were responsible for conscripting their own men. The logistics of feeding and equipping such a large army was a challenge in itself, especially in an agrarian society. The Great Army, with its sense of timing and its ruthless aggression, was not slow to act. In late 870 or early 871, they crossed the border into Wessex, establishing a fortified camp at Reading, a strategic location at the confluence of the rivers Thames and Kennet. The choice of Reading was not random. It afforded deep river access to the heart of Wessex and served as a secure base for their operations. The arrival of the Vikings at Reading was the final trumpet call, the signal that war had fully come to Wessex. For Æthelred and Alfred, this move meant that the moment of truth had arrived. All their preparations, their faith, and their courage would be put to the test. The fate of the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and perhaps the very future identity of England, depended on their ability to withstand this overwhelming force. The threat was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate and deadly reality, encamped within their own borders. The arrival of the great heathen armada at Reading, in the heart of Wessex, was the moment when patience and a strategy of restraint gave way to the imperative need for confrontation. For King Æthelred, this direct incursion into his territory was not just another attack. It was a declaration of all-out war, a challenge to the very existence of his kingdom. In contrast to the kings of Northumbria and East Anglia, who were subjugated or martyred, and Mercia, which chose to pay tribute, Æthelred and his first council of wise and noble men made an unequivocal and courageous decision. They would not give in. They would fight. This decision was not taken lightly. Wessex had been the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom to maintain its independence in the face of the Great Armada thus far, and this position was a testament to its military strength and the cohesion of its leadership. However, the cost of war was immense, and victory was not guaranteed. Paying the price Danegeld, as Mercia had done, might have offered temporary relief. But Æthelred, perhaps learning from the mistakes of his predecessors or driven by a sense of duty and honor, understood that the purchased peace was a fleeting illusion in the face of an enemy seeking not only riches, but lands to settle. A tribute would only delay the inevitable and further weaken the kingdom. Æthelred's resolve was therefore a demonstration of his leadership. He understood that the identity and freedom of his people depended on armed resistance. It was a risky gamble, for defeat would mean annihilation, but the alternative, submission, meant cultural and political death. The decision to fight, though heroic, imposed a tremendous burden on the king and his people. It meant mobilizing every man capable of bearing arms, raising resources to sustain the campaigns, and accepting inevitable losses. King Æthelred was not an armchair strategist. He was a leader who believed in being on the front lines with his men. His presence on the battlefield was essential to inspiring morale and loyalty among his men. Thangs and you're fired. With his brother Alfred at his side, forming a formidable partnership, they began to plan their military response. They could not afford to wait for the Vikings to spread their forces further. The threat needed to be contained, and if possible, repelled quickly. Æthelred's decision to fight was not just a tactical choice but an act of deep conviction. He probably saw the defense of Wessex as a defense of Christianity and his own Anglo-Saxon heritage. In a period when faith was a fundamental pillar of society, the fight against the heathens was not just a question of territory, but a holy war. This spiritual dimension may have strengthened his resolve and that of his men. History would remember Æthelred not for great reforms or a long reign of peace, but for his steadfastness and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. His decision not to give in and to fight marked the beginning of one of the most intense and bloody military campaigns in Anglo-Saxon history. A campaign that, though marked by setbacks, paved the way for the survival of Wessex and, ultimately, the unification of England. He became the last great bulwark against the Viking flood, a king who chose the sword over submission. With the great heathen army firmly entrenched at Reading, direct confrontation was now inevitable. King Æthelred's resolve to fight and not give in echoed throughout Wessex, and the kingdom's forces began to mobilize. It was not long before the first bloody encounters tested the mettle of the Wessex warriors and the effectiveness of their leadership in the face of such a ruthless and experienced enemy. The first major engagement occurred shortly after the Vikings settled in Reading. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the most important records of the period, record that Æthelwulf, the ealdorman of Berkshire, and his men were the first to engage a portion of the Viking army that had ventured out of the Reading camp to plunder. This engagement took place at Englefield on 31st December 870. The battle was a tactical success for the Saxons. They managed to drive back the Vikings, inflicting losses on them and demonstrating that Wessex would not be easily subdued. This initial victory, although small in scale, would have injected vital morale into the Wessex troops and confirmed the courage of their local leaders. However, the joy was short-lived. The Great Armada was not a force to be stopped by a single tactical defeat. 4 days later, on 4th of January 871, King Æthelred and Alfred with their combined forces marched on Reading. Their objective was clear: to dismantle the Viking camp and drive the invaders from their territory. The battle that followed was fierce and brutal. The Vikings had fortified their position, utilizing the natural defenses and building palisades to protect their camp. The Anglo-Saxon forces, accustomed to fighting in open ground, found it difficult to breach the defenses. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the violence of the fighting. The terrain was difficult, and the Vikings, accustomed to fighting in close formations, used their experience to resist the Saxon attacks. Unfortunately for Wessex, this first major assault on Reading resulted in a heavy defeat. The Anglo-Saxon forces were driven back with considerable casualties. Æthelwulf, the victorious ealdorman of Berkshire, who had led the attack at Englefield, was himself killed in the fighting. The loss of such a valiant leader, and the inability to dislodge the Vikings from their base at Reading, came as a bitter shock to the king and his people. These early engagements served as a litmus test for Æthelred and Alfred's leadership and the resilience of the Wessex army. They revealed the formidable nature of the enemy. The Vikings were not only fierce warriors, but also skilled strategists in fortification and defense. The initial battles, though mixed in their outcome, a small victory followed by a major defeat, served to recalibrate Anglo-Saxon expectations and tactics. Æthelred and Alfred realized that the war against the Great Army would be a protracted and exhausting struggle, requiring continual sacrifice and constant adaptability. The reality of the Viking threat had become painfully clear to the entire Kingdom of Wessex. The defeat at Reading on 4 January 871 was a crushing blow to the Kingdom of Wessex, and a rude awakening to the harsh realities of war against the great heathen army. After the small but encouraging victory at Englefield, where a Viking scout force was repulsed, King Æthelred and his brother Alfred rallied their combined forces, believing that they could dislodge the invaders from their newly established base at Reading. The expectation was that a victory would restore security and morale. The reality, however, proved to be much bleaker. Reading, located at the confluence of the River Thames and the River Kennet, was an ideal strategic location for the Vikings. They had quickly fortified the site, probably using palisades of wood and earth, and taking advantage of the natural barriers provided by the surrounding rivers and marshland. This type of fortification was a common Viking tactic and gave them a significant defensive advantage, making a frontal assault an extremely dangerous task. When the Anglo-Saxon forces, led personally by Æthelred and Alfred, advanced on Reading, they met fierce resistance. The Battle of Reading was not an open field battle in the classical sense, but rather an attack on a fortified position. The Wessex troops, probably the Fired, a militia of free men called up for military service, although brave and loyal, were not accustomed to fighting armies that dug in and defended positions. The main Anglo-Saxon formation was the shield wall, effective in line-on-line combat, but less suited to storming fortifications. The fighting was described as bloody and relentless. The Vikings, with their discipline and battle experience, held their ground. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that the Anglo-Saxons were put to flight, a clear indication of a decisive defeat. Casualties were heavy. Among the dead, regrettably, was Æthelwulf, the ealdorman of Berkshire, the same nobleman who had led the victorious defense of Englefield only a few days earlier. His death was a significant loss to the Wessex military leadership and a morale blow to the troops. The defeat at Reading was a profound shock to Æthelred and Alfred. It exposed the limitations of their tactics and the formidable strength of their enemy. The great army was not a band of marauders who would flee after a concentrated attack. It was a professional, well-organized army that had learned to fight and defend itself effectively. The reality check was the realization that the war in Wessex would be a protracted struggle, a grueling campaign of attrition, rather than a series of quick victories. The Vikings' ability to fortify themselves and withstand direct attack meant that victories would have to be won at a much higher cost than had been anticipated. For the people of Wessex, news of the defeat at Reading would have been devastating, undermining confidence and spreading fear. If the king himself and his brother, with the full force of their army, could not drive out the invaders, what hope was there? Yet this defeat, though bitter, also served as a catalyst. It forced Æthelred and Alfred to reassess their strategies, to seek new approaches, and to recognize the need for even greater resilience. The fight for Wessex's survival was only just beginning, and the Battle of Reading was the bloody prelude to a series of clashes that would define the fate of England. As if the great heathen armada were not already a threat in itself, Wessex's defeat at Reading was followed by even more grim and demoralizing news: the arrival of massive reinforcements for the Vikings. Shortly after the initial clashes in 871, a new and sizable force of Norse warriors landed in Britain and joined the Great Armada. This new wave of invaders, sometimes referred to as the Great Summer Armada or the Great Summer Army, was led by a king named Bagsec or Bagsac, and by Halfdan Ragnarsson, one of the original leaders of the Great Armada. The arrival of these reinforcements was not entirely unexpected, in the sense of coming as a complete surprise to the Anglo-Saxons, as Viking invasions often came in waves. However, the size and organization of these new armies was alarming. These were not small bands of raiders, but entire armies well-equipped and eager to join in the plunder and conquest. Their arrival dramatically increased the number of Viking warriors on English soil, further reinforcing the already overwhelming numerical and tactical advantage over the Wessex forces. For King Æthelred and Alfred, this news represented a huge psychological and strategic setback. The defeat at Reading had already shattered morale, and now the enemy was growing even stronger. Any hope of a quick victory or of driving the Vikings back in a single major battle was vanished in the face of the steady influx of Norse warriors. Rather than easing, the pressure on Wessex only increased, turning the struggle for survival into a race against time and the odds. The new Viking contingents brought with them not only more men, but also more ships, more resources, and presumably new tactics and leaders with ambitions of their own. This infusion of power allowed the Great Armada to step up its operations, launching more frequent and larger-scale raids and exploiting the weaknesses of the exhausted Fired of Wessex. For the Vikings, this was an effective strategy to keep constant pressure on the enemy, preventing them from recovering or regrouping their forces. The presence of Bagsec, a king, probably a leader of great prestige with a considerable following, alongside Halfdan, one of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons and one of the most prominent leaders of the initial invasion, indicated that this was no minor force. It was a new alliance of powers within the Great Armada, with its own objectives, but aligned with the goal of conquering Wessex. This union of forces gave the Vikings even greater maneuverability and firepower. The situation in Wessex thus became even more precarious. The kingdom was now facing not one, but two great armies, which, although operating under a unified leadership, could effectively launch attacks on multiple fronts or concentrate overwhelming force at a single point. Æthelred and Alfred were forced to deal with the reality that the war would be a test of endurance, where every victory would be hard-fought and every defeat catastrophic. The unexpected reinforcement of the Vikings transformed the conflict in Wessex from an uphill battle into a desperate struggle for existence. In an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the figure of the king was central, being not only the political leader but also the supreme commander of the military forces. In the case of Wessex during the Great Heathen Invasion, King Æthelred embodied this duality. However, the complexity of war against such an overwhelming force as the Great Heathen Army inevitably created tensions and challenges in the leadership structure. Although there is no direct record of major conflict or irreconcilable divisions between Æthelred and his brother Alfred, the power dynamics and pressures of war certainly created a divided leadership in terms of roles and occasionally strategies. King Æthelred, as monarch, was the holder of ultimate authority. He was responsible for summoning the Anglo-Saxon army, for making the final strategic decisions, for negotiating with the enemy, and for holding the kingdom together. His duty was to defend the land and the people, and he fulfilled this role admirably, participating in virtually every major battle of his reign. The weight of the crown, however, brought with it the responsibility of considering the long-term consequences of each action, which could lead to a more cautious approach at times. Alfred, on the other hand, although not king, was the second in command and the main commander in the field. His reputation as a courageous and cunning warrior grew with each battle. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Acer's biography often singles him out for his bravery and tactical skill at crucial moments. At Ashdown, for example, he led a decisive charge while Æthelred was still at mass, which may indicate a certain autonomy or impatience on Alfred's part, or perhaps a division of tasks where Alfred was the more active field commander. This situation, although it led to victory, could be interpreted as a moment of tactical disagreement or an overlap of authority, even if unintentional. The tension, if any, was probably not one of open rivalry, but rather inherent in the pressures of war. A king needed to be a symbol of unity and authority, while a general in the field needed to be decisive and sometimes take greater risks to gain an immediate tactical advantage. Æthelred, as king, could take a broader view, focused on preserving the kingdom as a whole, which included the possibility of paying Danegeld at times to gain time, a strategy that Alfredo, the warrior, could see as a sign of weakness or a betrayal of fighting principles. Furthermore, Æthelred's health, who died in 871, may have been failing towards the end of his reign, which might naturally have led Alfred to assume a more prominent role in military command. Divided leadership, therefore, did not mean a lack of unity of purpose, but rather a distribution of roles and responsibilities, which, under the constant pressure of war, could lead to friction or differing priorities between the monarch and his chief general. Ultimately, the collaboration between Æthelred and Alfred overcame any tensions inherent in their division of roles. Alfred's loyalty to his brother and Æthelred's acceptance of his brother's military prowess were crucial to Wessex's resilience. The leadership of Wessex was, in essence, a partnership between a king who bore the burden of the crown and a warrior prince who proved himself indispensable on the battlefield. This synergy, despite its potential friction points, was one of the key factors that allowed Wessex to withstand the Great Armada while other kingdoms fell. Anglo-Saxon warfare tactics, especially those employed by Wessex during the reign of Æthelred and into the era of Alfred, were fundamentally based on the tradition and military organization of society. The mainstay of the Anglo-Saxon military force was the Fyrd, a militia composed of free men of the kingdom, called up for military service in times of war. This force, although numerous, was composed of farmers and craftsmen who, while loyal and courageous, had limited training compared with the professional Viking warriors. Anglo-Saxon battle strategy in open fields was dominated by one formation, the shield wall. This was a simple but incredibly effective defensive and offensive tactic. Warriors formed a tight line, shoulder to shoulder, with their round wooden shields and sometimes leather or metal coverings stacked on top of each other, creating an impenetrable barrier. Long spears extended across the shields, forming a forest of spikes, while axes and short swords were used in close combat as the lines clashed. The cohesion of the shield wall was crucial. If one part of the line faltered or broke, the entire formation risked collapsing, exposing the warriors to slaughter. The strength of the shield wall lay in its ability to absorb the impact of enemy charges and to advance slowly, pushing back the enemy line. Discipline and coordination were essential. Vikings, noble professional warriors, better equipped with superior armor and weapons, formed the backbone of the shield wall, usually in the center, providing leadership and resistance. The rear and flanks were protected by the density of the formation itself, and ideally by the terrain. However, this tactic had its drawbacks, especially against an enemy as adaptable as the Vikings. The shield wall was most effective on flat, open terrain, where formation could be maintained. In rough terrain, dense forests, or in built-up areas, such as Reading, cohesion could be difficult to maintain. Furthermore, the shield wall was relatively slow and could be outflanked if the enemy was more mobile or exploited weaknesses at the extremes of the line. The Vikings, with their ability to launch lightning attacks and outflank Anglo-Saxon formations, were particularly adept at exploiting these vulnerabilities. Anglo-Saxon cavalry, though present, was used primarily for transport and reconnaissance, not for decisive charging attacks like later medieval cavalry. Knights dismounted to fight on foot in shield walls, demonstrating the primacy of heavy infantry. Ambush or surprise attack tactics were not as commonly employed by the Anglo-Saxons on a large scale, who preferred direct and honorable confrontation in the open field. The leadership of King Æthelred and Alfred was crucial to the implementation of these strategies. They had to inspire their men to hold the line, even under relentless attack. The coordination to summon and maintain a fire large and disciplined was a constant challenge, especially since the men of the fire were farmers who needed to return to their lands during the planting and harvesting season. This imposed limitations on prolonged campaigns. In short, Æthelred's Anglo-Saxon war strategies were based on the brute force of the shield wall and the courage of his men. While effective in many situations, they were put to the ultimate test against the great heathen army, an enemy that not only possessed overwhelming strength, but also flexible tactics and a willingness to fight to the death. That Wessex was able to survive such encounters would be a testament not only to the tactics of the shield wall, but to the resilience and determination of its leaders and people. The first months of 871, a period that became known as the Year of Battles in Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, were marked by a devastating human cost to the Kingdom of Wessex. King Æthelred and Alfred's decision to face the great heathen army head-on, though courageous, came at a heavy price in Anglo-Saxon lives. After the defeat at Reading, the war intensified, and each engagement brought with it a torrent of grief and despair for the families of Wessex. The defeat at Reading had been costly in itself. The death of Ealdorman Æthelwulf of Berkshire, an experienced military leader who had been victorious at Englefield, was a significant loss to the Wessex command. However, his death was only the prelude to many more. The great army, strengthened by the new contingents of warriors and determined to subdue Wessex, gave no respite. Battles and skirmishes followed one another at a frantic pace. After Reading, the Anglo-Saxons, under Æthelred and Alfred, were forced into a war of attrition. With each battle, whether a Pyrrhic victory or a clear defeat, the people of Wessex suffered irreparable losses. The Anglo-Saxon warriors were largely free men called up for military service, many of them farmers who left their lands and families to fight. The death of each of these men meant not only the loss of a warrior, but the loss of a family, the abandonment of a farm, and a dent in the productive capacity of the kingdom. An Anglo-Saxon chronicle mentions that there were, in all, 9 battles against the great army in Wessex during that year. Even if some of these battles were skirmishes or minor engagements, the implication is clear. The kingdom was constantly at war, and with each new engagement, more Anglo-Saxon blood was spilled. The Battle of Ashdown, a crucial victory for Wessex, also cost many lives. Even if Viking losses were greater, victory came at a considerable price. The loss of life extended beyond the battlefields. As the Vikings advanced across the land, they pillaged towns and villages, destroyed crops, and undoubtedly killed civilians. The famine and disease that often accompanied war also contributed to the mortality. Wessex's infrastructure, economy, and society were under immense stress. Widowed and orphaned families, abandoned lands, destroyed churches. All these were direct results of the high human cost of war. The losses were not just numerical, they were qualitative. Many of the Thangs, the professional warriors and leaders of their communities, died in combat. The loss of these experienced men and the military elite of Wessex would have been particularly felt, as they were the pillars of the shield wall and the leaders of the fired. Replacing these trained warriors was an even greater challenge than replenishing their numbers. For Æthelred and Alfred, the heavy human cost was a daily reality. They saw their men fall, their friends and allies die in battle. This constant loss, coupled with the pressure of facing a seemingly insatiable enemy, tested the resilience of their leadership. The early losses were a grim reminder that Wessex's survival would not be achieved easily, and that with every victory and defeat, the price paid was measured in lives. Grief and mourning became an integral part of the Wessex landscape that fateful year. In a period of such uncertainty and violence as the 9th century, the Christian faith was not just a personal belief, it was the very backbone of Anglo-Saxon society. The Catholic Church, with its bishops, priests, and monks, exerted an immense influence on the daily lives of people from the peasantry to the royalty. Faced with the existential threat of the great heathen army, the power of faith became an invaluable pillar in encouraging the troops and maintaining morale in Wessex. The Vikings were seen as pagans, worshippers of ancient, unknown gods whose practices were considered brutal and demonic by Christians. This religious distinction transformed the conflict from a mere territorial dispute into a holy war. Defending Wessex was not just about defending one's homeland, but about defending the very soul of the kingdom and one's faith in Christ against the forces of darkness. This religious narrative was a powerful motivator, inspiring men to fight with a bravery they might not have had out of loyalty to a king or a piece of land. Bishops and clergy played an active and crucial role in this process of encouragement. They were not only in the monasteries, they were advisors to the kings. They participated in the witans, advice, and many even accompanied troops on campaign. Before battles, it would be common for bishops and priests to hold masses, offer blessings, pray for victory, and absolve the sins of warriors, promising them a place in paradise if they died in combat defending Christianity. This promise of eternal salvation was a balm for the fear of death, and a powerful tool for strengthening men's resolve. An Anglo-Saxon chronicle and other accounts, such as Asser's biography of Alfred, often mention the importance of religion in the lives of Kings Æthelred and Alfred. Æthelred in particular is described as a deeply pious man. There is a famous episode before the Battle of Ashdown where Æthelred refuses to go into battle until his mass is finished. Regardless of the literal accuracy of this account, it underscores the priority that faith had for the king and society as a whole. This act of waiting for the completion of a religious ritual before facing certain death may have been interpreted by his troops as a sign of unwavering faith and a trust in divine protection, inspiring them further. In addition to blessings and prayers, the church was also a source of knowledge, morale, and in some cases, resources. Monasteries, although targets of Viking raids, could also provide refuge and logistical support for troops on the move. The message of unity and resilience, often preached by religious leaders, helped to maintain social cohesion and resist panic and demoralization. The defense of the church and its sacred goods was also a strong motive for men to take up arms. In short, the power of faith was not a passive element in the war against the Vikings. It was an active weapon. The bishops and clergy, with their prayers, their exhortations, and their promise of salvation, instilled courage and purpose in the hearts of the Wessex warriors. They transformed a defensive war into a crusade, raising the fighting spirit and providing a moral compass amid the carnage. Faith in God and the defense of Christianity were, for many Anglo-Saxons, the very reason for their resistance, and it was a crucial factor that helped Wessex withstand the pressure of the Great Armada. The Battle of Ashdown, fought on 8 January 871, was the most significant engagement of Æthelred's reign and a turning point in the struggle for Wessex's survival against the great heathen army. Following the defeat at Reading and the arrival of massive Viking reinforcements, Anglo-Saxon morale was shaken. However, Æthelred and Alfred did not give in. Instead, they rallied their forces and confronted the Vikings on a strategically high ground known as Ashdown, probably the Berkshire Downs, a high point that offered a tactical advantage. The Vikings, under the leadership of Kings Halfdan and Bagsec, were also ready to fight. They divided their forces into two parts, one led by the two pagan kings and the other by the earls. The Anglo-Saxons in turn were also divided, with King Æthelred leading one part of his troops against the Viking kings and Alfred leading the other part against the earl. The crucial moment of the battle, and one of the most famous episodes in Alfred's life, occurred at the beginning of the fighting. According to Æthelred's biography, while the Vikings were already in battle formation and ready to attack, King Æthelred was in his tent, absorbed in mass, refusing to move until the service was complete. The Viking forces, sensing the Anglo-Saxon hesitation, began to advance. Alfred, impatient and aware of the imminent danger of being outflanked or disorganized before the battle began, made a bold and unilateral decision. Without waiting for the king, he led his part of the Anglo-Saxon army in a decisive charge up the hill against the Earl Vikings. Alfred's action has been described as an act of extraordinary bravery. He charged the Vikings like a wild boar, a metaphor that evokes fury and determination. This unexpected charge threw the Viking formation into disarray and gave the Anglo-Saxons the initiative. Alfred's shield wall clashed with Æthelred. The fighting became a bloody massacre. King Æthelred, having finished his mass, joined the battle with his forces, attacking the part of the Viking army commanded by Halfdan and Bagsec. The Battle of Ashdown was long and brutal. The two armies fought fiercely for a considerable period, with neither side giving in. However, Anglo-Saxon courage and resilience, perhaps fueled by Alfred's faith and inspiring leadership, prevailed. Viking casualties were enormous. Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that one of the Viking kings, Bagsec, and 5 earl, among them Sidroc and Osbern, were killed. Bagsec's death was a devastating blow to the Viking leadership, and the loss of so many earl completely disorganized his forces. The Vikings were finally put to flight, pursued by the Anglo-Saxons for much of the night and the next day. The victory at Ashdown was a crushing triumph for Wessex, one of the few major open-field victories against the great heathen army. It did not drive the Vikings from England, but it saved Wessex from likely annihilation, restored Anglo-Saxon morale, and, most importantly, cemented Alfred's reputation as a brilliant military leader, paving the way for his future reign. Ashdown was not the end of the war, but it was the moment when Wessex proved that it could fight and win against the most overwhelming odds. The Battle of Ashdown was undoubtedly a resounding glory for Wessex, a victory that resounded throughout Anglo-Saxon Britain and brought momentary relief to a kingdom under siege. The death of a Viking king, Bagsec, and 5 of Æthelred was a devastating blow to the morale and command structure of the great heathen army. However, even the most glorious victories come at a price, and Ashdown was no exception. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that despite the triumph, the human cost to the Anglo-Saxons was considerable, making this victory a Pyrrhic glory. The nature of the war against the great heathen army was one of relentless attrition. Even when the Anglo-Saxons won, the losses were significant. The Wessex army, composed of free men called up for military service, was not a long-term professional army. After a battle as intense and bloody as Ashdown, even with victory, the physical and mental exhaustion of the troops was profound. Many warriors were wounded, exhausted, or had perished. The number of men available for the next campaign was constantly dwindling. In addition to the loss of life, there was the logistical challenge of keeping an army in the field. The men of the fired, they needed to return to their lands to plant and harvest, since agriculture was the basis of the kingdom's livelihood. A prolonged campaign meant the interruption of food production, which in the long run would lead to famine and economic collapse. The very sustenance of the army, food, water, supplies, weapons, was a complex issue. For Æthelred and Alfred, The victory at Ashdown was a morale boost, but also a reminder of the fragility of their position. They had won a battle, but not the war. The great army, though wounded, was still a colossal force, capable of regrouping and receiving new reinforcements. Its capacity to absorb losses was far greater than that of Wessex. The assassination of a king and several Earl Vikings, although impactful, did not destroy the overall leadership of the Great Armada, which still had formidable figures such as Halfdan Ragnarsson. The exhaustion was not only military but also economic and social. The land of Wessex, already under pressure from invasions and maintaining an army, was being drained of its resources. The civilian population suffered from constant threats, looting, and disruption of normal life. The glory of Ashdown was therefore tempered by the harsh reality that the kingdom could not afford to celebrate for long. The months following Ashdown would prove this cruel truth. Just 2 weeks after the victory at Ashdown, the Vikings regrouped and attacked Wessex again at the Battle of Basing, inflicting another defeat on the Anglo-Saxons. This demonstrated the incredible resilience and seemingly inexhaustible numbers of Viking warriors. The victory at Ashdown was a ray of hope, but it did not fundamentally change the balance of power in the long term. It merely bought time, allowed Wessex to continue fighting, and cemented Alfred's reputation as a military leader. Thus Ashdown was a glory, but a Pyrrhic glory. A victory won at such great cost that it almost felt like a defeat. It showed the bravery of Wessex, but also the exhaustion of their forces and the magnitude of the challenge that lay ahead. The breath it gave the kingdom would be crucial for the fighting that was yet to come, but it would not be enough to end the war. The victory at Ashdown, though costly, gave Æthelred and Alfred a position of momentary strength. Faced with the exhaustion of their own forces, and the recognition that the great heathen army, though wounded, was still massive and capable of receiving reinforcements, the Pyrrhic glory of Ashdown naturally led to consideration of an alternative strategy: the pursuit of peace, or more realistically, a truce. This was not a strategy of cowardice but of pragmatism. The aim was to gain time, to allow the lands to recover, for the men of the Fire to return to their farms, and the kingdom reorganize itself for the inevitable future confrontations. It is important to note that peace or truce negotiations with the Vikings were common at the time. They often involved the payment of Danegeld, a tribute, usually in silver or gold, in exchange for a promise that the Vikings would leave the territory or cease raiding for a period of time. Although seen today as a sign of weakness, Danegeld was a survival tactic. Many Anglo-Saxon and Frankish kingdoms had already resorted to this measure to avoid complete destruction. For the Vikings, gold was as worthy a goal as land conquest, and a large payment might be more attractive than the risk and cost of a prolonged war against a resilient opponent like Wessex. After Ashdown, the historical annals are somewhat ambiguous about the exact terms of any negotiations that may have taken place. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that the Vikings, after Basing, which came shortly after Ashdown and was a Saxon defeat, returned to Reading, and that a truce was reached. However, it is plausible that preliminary talks or attempts at an agreement began after the victory at Ashdown, with Wessex seeking to capitalize on the Viking disorganization following the death of Bagzek and the others. Earl. The negotiations would be complex and dangerous. They would require the presence of emissaries, perhaps even Alfred himself, to meet with Viking leaders such as Halfdan. Trust was in short supply, and the Vikings were notorious for not honoring agreements if a more advantageous opportunity arose. The terms would include the withdrawal of the Great Armada from Wessex territory for a set period of time, in exchange for a large sum of gold or silver, and perhaps a promise not to raid again for a specified period. Æthelred's decision to consider a truce, if he did, demonstrated his understanding of Wessex's desperate situation. He knew that, despite Ashdown, his kingdom could not sustain a sustained campaign of attrition against an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. A truce, even a temporary and costly one, would give Wessex the breathing space it needed. It would allow it to replenish troops, harvest food, and prepare for the next phase of the war. However, such a quest for peace was always a gamble. The Vikings might accept payment and leave, only to return later in greater force as they had done with other kingdoms. A truce was at best a reprieve, not a permanent solution. This phase of negotiations, or at least the consideration of them, reflects the complexity of the war and the difficult position in which Æthelred found himself. He was not only a warrior king, but also a statesman, forced to balance the honor of battle with the pragmatic need to survive. The pursuit of peace was a tactic to preserve the kingdom, even if it meant paying a price that would leave Wessex poorer and even more vulnerable. If there was a truce negotiated between Wessex and the Great Heathen Army in 871, either after the Battle of Ashdown or, more likely, after the Battle of Wilton, which occurred later that year and was a Saxon defeat, it came with a steep price: the Danegeld. The payment of the Danegeld was not new in Anglo-Saxon England. Other kingdoms, such as Mercia, had already given in to this demand in exchange for a promise, often empty, that the Vikings would leave or cease their raids. For Wessex, the cost of such a truce would represent a monumental financial and economic burden, capable of draining the kingdom's resources and leaving deep scars. The Danegeld was essentially a ransom or tribute. It was a colossal sum of silver, and sometimes gold, demanded by the Vikings to end their hostilities. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles do not specify the exact amount paid by Wessex in 871, but payments on other occasions and in other kingdoms ranged from thousands to tens of thousands of pounds of silver. To put this in perspective, a pound of silver was a fortune at the time. To raise such a quantity of the precious metal would have required a heavy tax on the population, emptying the royal coffers, and probably requiring churches and monasteries to contribute from their treasuries. The financial burden on Wessex would be felt at all levels of society. The peasants and artisans, the mainstay of the economy, would be forced to pay higher taxes, perhaps in the form of goods or labor. Coinage would be stepped up to convert raw silver into payable currency. Collecting and transporting so much wealth would be a complex and dangerous task. Many might find their most valuable possessions confiscated to comply with the Viking demand. In addition to the financial aspect, the Danegeld imposed a moral and psychological cost. For the people, paying tribute to the heathens was a humiliation, an acknowledgement of enemy superiority. It could undermine morale, confidence in the king, and fighting spirit. For the royals, although it was a pragmatic measure to buy time and avoid further bloodshed, it was an admission of vulnerability. For the Vikings, the Danegeld was a vital source of wealth and a way to finance their campaigns. The money could be used to pay their warriors, buy supplies, build or repair ships, and keep their army moving. Most importantly, the payment of the truce showed that they had subdued the kingdom, at least temporarily, and could extract wealth without the cost and risk of further battles. However, the truce and payment of Danegeld were rarely permanent solutions. The Vikings were notorious for breaking such agreements when it suited them, using the money to strengthen themselves and then returning with new demands. The history of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, such as Mercia, which repeatedly paid Danegeld only to be invaded again, serves as a grim precedent. For Wessex, the truce of 871, if it came to pass, was a vital respite, enabling them to survive the year of battles and recover from their heavy losses. But it was a breather bought at an exorbitant price, and the Viking threat, as it would soon be seen, was far from over. The debt and humiliation of Danegeld would be remembered for generations. The year 871 was a relentlessly testing time for Wessex, and one of the most exhausting factors for the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was the continual arrival of new waves of Vikings. Even after the victorious but Pyrrhic Battle of Ashdown and the heavy defeat at Reading, the Great Heathen Army seemed to have an inexhaustible flow of warriors from the Norse lands. These continual reinforcements undermined Anglo-Saxon morale and made final victory an ever more distant goal. The nature of the Viking raids of the 9th century was not that of a single monolithic force. Rather, it was a series of armies and raiding parties, sometimes operating independently, sometimes uniting under a charismatic leader for larger campaigns. The Great Heathen Armada of 865 was the most significant coalition to date, but even this original armada was constantly reinforced by new fleets of young warriors, Ordrangar, who sought fame, fortune, and land in fertile Britain. News of the plunder and conquest in England and the promise of Danegeld acted like a magnet, attracting more and more Scandinavian warriors. An Anglo-Saxon chronicle explicitly mentions the arrival of a great summer army in 871, led by King Bagzek, who joined forces with Halfdan and Ubba. This new force drastically increased the Viking contingent, making up for losses suffered at battles such as Ashdown. The Vikings' ability to replenish their ranks quickly was an overwhelming advantage over the fired Anglo-Saxon, which took time to assemble, train, and equip. Furthermore, the Anglo-Saxon losses were of human capital that the kingdom would take a long time to recover, while Scandinavia seemed to have a steady supply of young and ambitious warriors. The arrival of these new forces allowed the Vikings to maintain relentless pressure on Wessex. They could divide their forces to raid several areas simultaneously, or concentrate them to crush Anglo-Saxon resistance at a strategic point. For Æthelred and Alfred, this meant that they could never afford a long period of rest or recuperation. Each time Wessex achieved a victory, however small, or forced a truce, the Vikings would regroup, often with new and fresh warriors. This dynamic of attritional warfare was demoralizing. Imagine the frustration of a king who, after a hard-fought and victorious battle, discovers that the enemy, instead of retreating, is being strengthened by new waves of invaders. The feeling of fighting against an unstoppable tide must have been overwhelming. The new Viking waves were not just a military problem. They were an economic, social, and psychological burden. They meant more plunder, more demands on Danegeld, more disruption to normal life, and a constant fear that at any moment a new Viking force might appear and devastate what was left. The continual arrival of reinforcements for the great heathen army was one of the greatest challenges Æthelred and Alfred faced. It turned the war in Wessex into a race against exhaustion, where victory seemed to come not from annihilating the enemy, but from simply outlasting them. Wessex's resilience, then, is a testament not only to the bravery of its leaders and warriors, but also to its ability to withstand an enemy that seemed to regenerate itself endlessly. The year 871, the year of battles in Anglo-Saxon chronicle, was a time of unremitting trial for King Æthelred of Wessex. With each defeat or Pyrrhic victory, the great heathen army seemed to regroup with astonishing rapidity, forcing the king into a relentless struggle, an almost non-stop military campaign. There was no time for rest, recuperation, or long-term planning. The survival of Wessex depended on its king's ability to be constantly on the move, responding to Viking raids and defending the borders of his kingdom. From the time the Vikings arrived at Reading in late 870 or early 871, Æthelred and his brother Alfred had been drawn into a whirlwind of battles and skirmishes. After the defeat at Reading came the glorious victory at Ashdown, but this joy was short-lived. Within just 2 weeks, the Vikings had regrouped and again engaged the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Basing, which resulted in another defeat for Wessex. The Vikings' ability to absorb losses and continue fighting was impressive, and for Æthelred this meant that he could not afford to retreat. Æthelred's need to be constantly on campaign was multifaceted. First, the Vikings did not sit still. They moved, raided, and established new bases, threatening different parts of the kingdom. The king had to respond to each threat by mobilizing his fired and marching to where the danger was greatest. Second, the king's presence on the battlefield was crucial to the morale of the troops. In a society where personal loyalty to the monarch was vital, Æthelred's absence could have demoralized his men and encouraged desertion. He was the symbol of resistance. Third, war was a matter of attrition. Although the Great Armada was vast, it also required resources, and the Vikings were constantly seeking plunder to sustain their forces. Æthelred's constant resistance prevented the Vikings from plundering the kingdom at will, forcing them to fight for every gain. Every battle, even a defeat, inflicted losses on the enemy and slowed their advance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that, in addition to Reading, Ashdown, and Basing, there were other engagements in 871, including the Battle of Merton, which also resulted in a Saxon defeat. These battles, fought in quick succession, demonstrate the relentless pressure on Æthelred. He had not had a moment's rest since assuming the throne. His life became an uninterrupted series of forced marches, battle planning, and bloody combat. This relentless struggle took an immense physical and mental toll on the king. The constant strain, the loss of men, the responsibility of a kingdom at risk, all of this must have contributed to his physical decline. It is plausible, though not definitively proven, that this exhaustion contributed to his early death in 871. Æthelred's life on the throne of Wessex was, in its entirety, one continuous military campaign. He was not a king who enjoyed a reign of peace and prosperity. He was a king who, from his coronation until his death, was on the front line, defending his kingdom against an overwhelming enemy. His tireless struggle is the heart of his legacy, and a testament to his determination to preserve Wessex at all costs. While King Æthelred bore the burden of the crown and led the relentless struggle against the great heathen army, his younger brother Alfred operated in a crucial, if often shadowy, supporting role. Yet it was precisely during this period of intense and continuous warfare that Alfred, the future great, forged his reputation, honed his military skills, and matured as a leader, growing exponentially in combat experience and strategy. Alfred was no mere prince by title. From the beginning of the Viking invasion of Wessex, he had stood shoulder to shoulder with Æthelred in every major battle. At the Battle of Reading, although a defeat, he fought bravely. But it was at the Battle of Ashdown that his performance became legendary. While King Æthelred refused to leave the mass, Alfred, seeing the imminent danger of a Viking attack disorganizing the Saxon troops, took the bold step of leading his part of the army in a decisive charge against the enemies. His courage and tactical acumen were vital to the Anglo-Saxon victory that day. This act demonstrated not only his personal bravery, but a leadership ability and strategic vision that set him apart. Throughout 871, the year of battles, Alfred participated in all 9 engagements recorded by Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Every skirmish, every battle, from Englefield to Reading, Ashdown, Basing, and Merton, was an object lesson in warfare tactics, military logistics, and the management of men under the most extreme stress. He witnessed firsthand the advantages and disadvantages of the Saxon shield wall, the siege tactics of the Vikings, the importance of mobility, and the relentless resilience of the enemy. This total immersion in warfare allowed Alfred to develop his own skills of command. He learned the art of moving troops, organizing defenses, motivating men, and reacting quickly to fluid situations on the battlefield. While Æthelred was focused on the general administration of the kingdom and spiritual leadership, Alfred seemed to be the tactical engine, the general who was constantly at the center of the action. The cooperative relationship between the brothers was a cornerstone of Wessex's resilience. Æthelred, a pious and perhaps physically frail king, trusted Alfred to lead his troops into battle. This trust allowed Alfred a degree of autonomy that was crucial to his development. He was not just an executor of orders, but a budding strategist, testing his own ideas and learning from each success and failure. The period of his service under Æthelred was Alfred's school of war. It was here that he observed the devastation wrought by the Vikings, the ineffectiveness of the fragmented approaches of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the need for a unified and well-organized defense. These lessons would prove invaluable when he himself ascended the throne. His experience at Æthelred's side shaped Alfred into the kind of king that Wessex needed to survive. A king who not only ruled, but led his men into battle and understood the complexities of war on an epic scale. The brother in the shadows was, in effect, forging himself in the fires of battle to become his people's greatest hope. After the Pyrrhic glory of Ashdown, which had cost both sides dearly, the kingdom of Wessex had only a brief respite. The great heathen army, despite its losses, demonstrated an astonishing ability to regroup quickly. Less than 2 weeks after the Battle of Ashdown, sometime in mid-January 871, the Vikings again engaged the forces of Wessex at the Battle of Basing. This encounter, yet another in the grueling series of engagements of the Year of Battles, was another brutal reminder of Viking resilience and the inability of Æthelred and Alfred to drive them out of their territory. The exact location of Basing is uncertain, but it is presumed to have been near the town of Basingstoke in Hampshire. The Vikings, under the leadership of Halfdan Ragnarsson, now the main leader after the death of Bagsec at Ashdown, and possibly others who had arrived with reinforcements, prepared for battle. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles are succinct but clear. The Battle of Basing was yet another defeat for the Anglo-Saxons. What led to this defeat, so soon after the victory at Ashdown, can be attributed to several factors. First, the exhaustion of the Wessex forces was palpable. The Fyrd had been subjected to an almost uninterrupted series of marches and battles. The casualties at Reading and Ashdown, even in victory, had thinned their ranks. Recruiting and replacing men was a slow and arduous process. In contrast, the Vikings, although they too had suffered losses, seemed to have a steady stream of fresh warriors and a greater ability to absorb and regroup their forces quickly. Second, the Viking tactic of entrenching themselves and fighting from defensive positions had proven effective. If Basing was an Anglo-Saxon attack on a fortified position, such as Reading, this would explain the difficulties the Fyrd had to break through enemy defenses. Even in open fields, the Vikings were formidable warriors, accustomed to fighting in tight formations and with relentless ferocity. The Battle of Basing was another bloody clash, where the Wessex warriors fought bravely, but were outmatched. Anglo-Saxon Chronicles simply reports that the Vikings gained the victory. For Æthelred and Alfred, this defeat was a devastating blow to morale. Coming so soon after the celebration of Ashdown, it reinforced the painful reality that for all their courage and strategy, they still lacked the means to drive off the great armada of Wessex. The Vikings' ability to hold on, to recover from defeat, and to keep pushing forward was frightening. This battle underlined the nature of the war of attrition that Æthelred was waging. It was not a war that could be won in a single decisive battle. It was a protracted struggle, with each victory hard-fought and each defeat increasing the burden on the kingdom. Basing, though less celebrated than Ashdown, was a grim reminder that the great heathen army was firmly entrenched in Wessex, and that the struggle to drive them out would be a much longer and more arduous journey than anyone could have imagined. Wessex's resilience would be tested to the limit. Throughout the Year of Battles, 871, the Wessex forces, led by Æthelred and Alfred, were subjected to relentless pressure that resulted in widespread exhaustion of the army and severe shortages of resources. The fight against the great heathen army was not just a matter of bravery on the battlefield, but a test of endurance at every level, and the Kingdom of Wessex felt the brunt of this war of attrition acutely. The main military force of Wessex was the Fyrd, composed of free men who served as warriors in times of need. Although loyal and brave, these men were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who, when called upon, left their lands and civilian lives to fight for king and kingdom. Their service was limited in length, and the need to return to tend their lands, especially during the planting and harvest seasons, placed severe restrictions on prolonged campaigning. The almost uninterrupted succession of battles, Englefield, Reading, Ashdown, Basing, and soon after Meriton, placed an unbearable strain on these men. They were constantly on the march, in continuous combat, and suffering losses at every engagement. The numbers of dead and wounded were high, and replacing these men was a slow and difficult process. The loss of experienced thanes, noble warriors, was particularly debilitating, as it was they who formed the backbone of the shield wall and provided local leadership. Morale, though boosted by victories such as Ashdown, was constantly tested by defeats and the realization that the enemy seemed inexhaustible. In addition to the human toll, war was a drain on Wessex's resources. The cost of sustaining an army on campaign was astronomical for the agrarian economy of the time. Food and supplies had to be gathered and transported. Equipment and weapons had to be forged and repaired, and Viking plundering of farmland and settlements caused severe disruptions to production. Wessex's ability to keep its army equipped and fed for any length of time was limited. The pressure to pay the Danegeld, if negotiated, added to this financial burden. Demanding large sums of silver from the population meant impoverishing the kingdom and diverting resources that could have been used for defense or economic recovery. Wessex's infrastructure, roads, bridges, fortifications, was also under stress, either from wear and tear from military use or from the destruction wrought by the Vikings. Lack of resources and exhaustion of the army were critical factors that limited Æthelred's options. He could not simply raise a new army of trained men at a moment's notice. nor could he sustain prolonged offensive campaigns. This forced him to adopt a defensive strategy, reacting to Viking movements and fighting battles often under unfavorable conditions. The exhaustion of the Anglo-Saxon army was an endemic problem that would persist well into Alfred's reign. The capacity of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom to sustain an all-out war against an invading enemy with different resources and a different mindset was limited. Æthelred felt this exhaustion acutely in his short reign, and it was one of the factors that contributed to the outcome of his time on the throne and the difficult choices he and his brother were forced to make. The year 871 AD, already marked by a relentless succession of battles against the great heathen army, witnessed the death of King Æthelred of Wessex. His death, however, is shrouded in some mystery, as the historical sources of the time are concise and do not provide a definitive and detailed account of the cause. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the main source for the period, simply records that Æthelred departed, or perished, after Easter that year. This brevity has fueled various theories over the centuries, the most prominent of which are that he died from battle wounds or from disease. The theory that Æthelred died of battle wounds is quite plausible and widely accepted by many historians. The year 871 was a period of almost continuous combat for the King of Wessex. He and Alfred fought in numerous battles: Englefield, Reading, Ashdown, Basing, and finally the Battle of Meryton, or Merton, which occurred shortly before his death. Meryton was yet another defeat for the Anglo-Saxons, in which, according to the Chronicle, many lives were lost. As a warrior king who led his troops from the front, Æthelred would have been constantly exposed to danger. It is entirely conceivable that he suffered serious wounds at Meryton or in one of the other recent engagements, which, given the limitations of medieval medicine, could have become infected or worsened, leading to his death. The absence of an explicit mention of a heroic death in battle may be attributed to the brevity of the record, or to a desire not to overshadow the image of his successor, Alfred, or even to a desire to protect the morale of the kingdom. The image of a king dying from wounds sustained through his sacrifice in battle would have had a powerful appeal. The second, equally plausible theory is that Æthelred succumbed to illness. Life in the 9th century, especially for someone leading an army on campaign, was brutal and unsanitary. Sanitation was poor, diet was often inadequate, and the physical and mental stress of constant warfare was immense. Infectious diseases such as dysentery, fevers, and epidemics were rampant and claimed lives quickly. It is possible that the king, already exhausted by battle and the pressure of ruling a besieged kingdom, contracted an illness that his weakened body was unable to fight off. Illness rather than a battle wound would explain the lack of dramatic detail in the story. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which would tend to glorify death in combat. Death from disease, although less heroic, was a common reality at the time. Other, less likely theories include the possibility that he died of old age, although he was not particularly elderly, probably in his 20s or 30s, or even some sort of complication of a pre-existing health condition. The fact is that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers of the time, while recording military events in some detail, rarely went into the specific causes of their kings' deaths unless they were of major political importance, such as assassination. Æthelred's death, whatever the exact cause, came at a critical time. It ended a short but bitterly fought reign and paved the way for the accession of his brother, Alfred, who inherited not only the throne but the same relentless war. The mystery surrounding his death only adds a layer of intrigue to a reign that was, in every sense, a sacrifice for the survival of Wessex. Æthelred's death in 871 AD, even with the mystery surrounding it, marked a decisive turning point for the Kingdom of Wessex and for the history of England itself. His reign was brief, but intensely marked by the war against the great heathen army. The question of the unknown legacy naturally arises. How would history have been different if Æthelred had lived and continued to reign, perhaps for another decade or two? This is a fascinating speculation that allows us to reflect on the impact of individual leadership in moments of crisis. First, it is crucial to consider the nature of Æthelred's leadership. He was, as we have seen, a courageous warrior king who personally led his troops into numerous battles. He made the decision not to give in and fight, which in itself was an act of monumental bravery. His records do not suggest that he was a weak or incompetent king. However, he is not remembered as a great strategist or a reformer. His primary focus, understandably, was the immediate defense of the realm. Had Æthelred lived, the first and most obvious difference would have been the immediate absence of Alfred the Great on the throne. Alfred, who became one of the greatest monarchs in English history, implemented military, naval, educational, and legal reforms that were crucial to the survival and flourishing of Wessex, and later, to the unification of England. Without Alfred's early accession, many of these reforms might not have occurred, or might have been implemented much later, perhaps with different results. For example, the restructuring of the army into a more sustainable system, with rotating troops and permanent garrisons in burhs, fortified towns, was an innovation of Alfred's. Æthelred, being constantly on campaign, may not have had the time or inclination to implement such sweeping reforms. The absence of such innovations could have meant that Wessex remained more vulnerable to prolonged Viking attacks. In addition, Alfred is credited with an intellectual and cultural renaissance in Wessex, promoting literacy and the translation of Latin texts into Old English. This initiative was instrumental in preserving Anglo-Saxon culture and educating a new generation of administrators. Æthelred, though pious, is not associated with a cultural project of such magnitude. The absence of such a renaissance could have led to an even greater decline in Anglo-Saxon learning and identity. Æthelred's foreign policy might also have been different. Alfred, after years of fighting, managed not only to repel the Vikings from Wessex, but also to forge peace agreements that led to the establishment of the Danelaw, an area under Viking control, but which allowed Wessex to grow stronger. He then set about reconquering and unifying the smaller Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Æthelred, though a warrior, may not have had the vision or diplomatic skills for such long-term strategies, or he may have focused purely on the defense of Wessex, without aiming for the unification of all England. Could the great heathen armada have subjugated Wessex if Æthelred had continued to reign? It is a possibility, given the grueling cost of war and Viking resilience. The continued burden of battles might have broken the backbone of Wessex without Alfred's innovations. In short, Æthelred's death, though tragic for its time, opened the door to the reign of one of the greatest kings in English history. Without his death, the great Alfred might have remained in the shadows, and the strategies that saved Wessex and forged England might never have been implemented, or would have come too late. Æthelred's unknown legacy is what it could have been, a story of continued resilience, but perhaps without the brilliant transformation that his brother would bring. The death of King Æthelred in 871 AD, whether from battle wounds or disease, threw the kingdom of Wessex into a perilous juncture. With the Viking enemy still firmly entrenched in his lands and the war raging, the question of immediate succession became an urgent and life-or-death priority. Although Æthelred had sons, including the young Æthelwold, Anglo-Saxon law at the time did not strictly adhere to primogeniture. In times of crisis, the Council of Wise Men and Nobles, had the prerogative of electing the most suitable member of the royal house to the throne, and the choice, in the chaos of war, was unanimous and decisive. Alfred, Æthelred's younger brother, ascended to the crown of Wessex. This decision, while perhaps predictable to some, was a testament to the widespread recognition of the skill and maturity that Alfred had demonstrated on the battlefield alongside his brother. Aged around 22 at the time, Alfred had already fought in all 9 major battles against the great heathen army that fateful year. He had led decisive charges, displayed unquestionable bravery, and proved himself a natural strategist. His military experience, at a time when the kingdom was at all-out war, was an invaluable attribute that outweighed the claim of any child or young man. Alfred's coronation was not an event of great pomp and celebration, but rather an act of necessity and pragmatism. He inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse, exhausted by war, its lands plundered, its population terrorized, and its treasury depleted. The Armada had not been driven out and continued to pose an existential threat. His accession to the throne was, in essence, the assumption of a heavy burden in the midst of a perfect storm. Alfred's first challenge as king was exactly what his brother had faced: war with the Vikings. He had no time to mourn or to consolidate his authority peacefully. Shortly after his coronation, Alfred was forced to lead his troops into yet another battle, the Battle of Wilton, which resulted in yet another defeat for Wessex. Although the Vikings also suffered significant losses, this string of defeats underscored the fragility of Alfred's position and the urgency of the situation. Despite initial setbacks, Alfred's accession to the throne amid the chaos of war was a providential event for Wessex. His reign, though it began under the most dire of conditions, would prove to be a turning point for the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The experience he had gained alongside Æthelred, combined with his own intelligence and determination, would enable him to implement the military, political, and cultural reforms that would ultimately not only save Wessex, but lay the foundations for the formation of a unified England. Alfred's immediate succession was not just a transition of power, it was the passing of the baton in a relay race for survival, and the new king was determined that Wessex would not fall. The crown, now in his hands, was more a burden of war than a symbol of glory. The death of King Æthelred in 871 AD did not bring an end to the war. On the contrary, continued Viking fury was the grim reality that Alfred inherited in his place. The great heathen army, which had terrorized Wessex during Æthelred's reign, did not retreat or lessen its aggression after the change of monarch. The threat persisted, and the new king, Alfred, was immediately thrown back into the thick of the fighting, facing the same challenges as his brother. The year of battles of 871 did not end with Æthelred's death. Shortly after Alfred assumed the throne, he was forced to lead the Wessex army into yet another bloody battle, the Battle of Wilton. Although the chronicles are sparse, the result was a defeat for the Anglo-Saxons, who were scattered. This defeat, coupled with the earlier defeats at Reading and Basing, underlined the persistence of the Viking threat and Wessex's inability to completely expel them from the kingdom. The Vikings, under the leadership of Halfdan, remained in Wessex, continuing to raid and maintain a threatening presence. The Viking strategy after Æthelred's death was clear: keep up the pressure. They had ravaged other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and although Wessex was proving a tough nut to crack, the great army believed that with time and attrition, the last bastion would fall. The Vikings' persistence was remarkable. They never tired of fighting, demanding tribute, or settling lands. To them, England was a rich land to be explored and conquered. The continued Viking rampage forced Alfred into a series of pragmatic decisions. Although he suffered initial defeats, he also negotiated a Danegeld with the Vikings after Wilton. This was not a sign of outright weakness, but a calculated tactic to buy time. The payment of a large sum of silver caused the Vikings to withdraw from Wessex for a time, settling in London, in Mercia, and then Repton, in the heart of Mercia. This temporary retreat gave Alfred the breathing space he desperately needed. However, this truce was fragile and temporary. The Vikings did not leave for good. They simply moved on to other parts of England, consolidating their control there and waiting for the next opportunity. The threat never completely disappeared. The years that followed Æthelred's reign would be marked by further Viking raids and attempts to conquer Wessex, culminating in 878 with the surprise invasion that forced Alfred into hiding in the marshes of Athelney, one of the most desperate moments of his life. The persistence of Viking fury after Æthelred's death is testament to the relentless character of the great army. They were not an enemy to be easily defeated or demoralized. Their aim was total conquest, and a change of king did not change that determination. Alfred inherited not only the crown, but also a war that would take years to control, requiring all his wits, resilience, and the loyalty of his people to finally turn back the Viking tide and lay the foundations of a new England. The Viking shadow hung over Æthelred's reign and continued to hang over Alfred for a long time to come. From their arrival in Britain, the great heathen army operated not as a roving band of raiders, but as an organized and strategically astute army. A key part of their ability to sustain long campaigns and conquer territories was their ability to establish and maintain fortified Viking camps, which served as operational bases, command centers, places of refuge, and storage for plunder. In Wessex, the presence of such camps was a physical testament to the persistent threat and adaptability of the raiders. The first major Viking camp in Wessex, and the one that marked the beginning of the direct invasion, was at Reading in late 870 or early 871. The choice of location was not random. Reading is strategically located at the confluence of two rivers, the Thames and the Kennet. This riverside position was crucial to the Vikings, as their long ships, light, shallow draft ships, allowed them to sail upriver, penetrating deep into Anglo-Saxon territory, far from the coast and possible naval defenses. Once established, the rivers also served as supply routes and quick escape routes. The organization of these camps was remarkable. They were not just clusters of tents. Chronicles and archaeological evidence suggest that the Vikings were quick to fortify their positions. At Reading, and at other sites such as Repton, in Mercia, where the Vikings camped after leaving Wessex in 871, they used natural defenses such as hills and river bends, and supplemented them with earthworks and wooden palisades. They dug deep ditches and built dikes, often recycling old Roman structures or using the features of the terrain to their advantage. This turned their camps into temporary fortresses, almost impregnable to the Anglo-Saxons of the time, who lacked effective siege artillery. Within the camps, the infrastructure was more than basic. They housed thousands of warriors, their horses, which they acquired on English soil to move more quickly overland, and their plunder. There were spaces for lodging, forging weapons and repairing equipment, and for storing supplies. The camps also served as control centers for the conquered lands, where Viking leaders could plan their next campaigns, negotiate tribute, the Danegeld, and even mint their own coins. The presence of a Viking camp on Wessex soil was a constant reminder of occupation and threat. For the local population, it meant loss of control over their lands, the danger of constant plunder, and the imposition of a foreign power. For Anglo-Saxon kings such as Æthelred and later Alfred, the Vikings' ability to establish and maintain such camps made expulsion a formidable logistical and military challenge. They could not simply attack and win a battle. They had to destroy the basis of Viking power. The persistence of these camps after Æthelred's death and Alfred's need to deal with them in his own campaign to repel the Vikings demonstrates how central they were to the strategy of the Great Armada. They were the physical manifestation of Viking rule and the backbone of their occupation, a problem that would only be solved by Alfred's own innovations in fortification and military organization, which he would learn much from observing the effectiveness of Viking bases. While kings and ealdormen as the English fought on the battlefields, the true story of the war against the great heathen army was lived daily by the common people of Wessex. This vast majority of men and women, farmers, craftsmen, and traders, were not on the front lines of the shield wall, but were the ones who sustained the kingdom and who suffered the most direct and brutal consequences of the invasion. Their resilience in the face of such adversity is a testament to the strength of the Anglo-Saxon spirit and the depth of their attachment to the land and to their faith. The lives of ordinary people were turned upside down by the arrival of the Vikings. The main form of plunder was plunder. Villages and farms were easy targets for the Vikings in search of food, livestock, gold, silver, and valuable goods. The plundering was relentless, with homes being burned, crops destroyed, and animals slaughtered or stolen. This systematic plunder not only destroyed wealth, but also undermined the ability of communities to survive, leading to famine and poverty. In addition to plunder, the population was under constant threat of violence and enslavement. Men, women, and children could be killed, injured, or taken as slaves by the Vikings to be sold in slave markets in Scandinavia or elsewhere. Fear was a constant presence. The disruption to normal life was massive. People could no longer farm their land safely. Trade routes were dangerous, and the basic social order was constantly challenged. The burden of supporting the army and paying the Danegeld fell heavily on the population. Taxes were increased, and families were often forced to give up their most precious possessions to contribute to the sum demanded by the Vikings. The presence of the drafted army, meant that many young, able-bodied men were taken away from their families and their lands during crucial planting and harvesting periods, which in turn led to food shortages. However, the common people also demonstrated a remarkable capacity for resistance and adaptation. It was not just a question of armed struggle, but of passive resistance and survival. People took refuge in forests, swamps, or in-burhs fortifications when danger approached. They rebuilt their homes and their lives after each raid, with a determination that bordered on the miraculous. Religious faith, as mentioned above, was a pillar of their resilience. The fight against the heathens was seen as a defense of one's own soul, and belief in God and the saints helped maintain hope in dark times. Communities, though terrorized, remained united, and local solidarity was crucial to survival. Although historical sources focus on the deeds of kings and warriors, the narrative of the great heathen invasion is largely the story of the resilience of the people of Wessex. They were the foundation upon which Æthelred and later Alfred built their resistance. Without the ability of these ordinary men and women to endure hardship, to continue to work the land under threat, and to maintain their faith and their communities, the Kingdom of Wessex would have collapsed much sooner. Their resilience was not just a passive virtue, it was an active factor in the survival of the kingdom, enabling the fight to continue even when the odds seemed insurmountable. In any medieval society, the figure of the king was the central pillar of order, law, and defense. In times of peace, he was the lawgiver, the supreme judge, and the guarantor of prosperity. However, in times of invasion and total war, such as that which Wessex faced with the Great Heathen Armada, the role of royalty transformed dramatically, acquiring a monumental responsibility that went far beyond mere governance. It was the guarantee of the very survival of the kingdom and its people. For kings like Æthelred and his successor Alfred, the primary responsibility was military defense. This meant personally leading troops into battle, often from the front lines, inspiring bravery and loyalty by example. The king was expected to be a warrior, a leader who did not fear combat. This direct military leadership was vital to mobilize and motivate the fired Anglo-Saxon, a militia force that depended on the presence and charisma of the monarch. In addition to commanding on the battlefield, the king had the strategic responsibility of coordinating the defense of the kingdom. This included raising and supplying troops, building or repairing fortifications, such as burhs which Alfred would later develop, and making crucial decisions about where and when to confront the enemy. It was a game of chess on a grand scale, where every move could mean the loss of lands, cities, or even the annihilation of the kingdom. Royalty was also responsible for maintaining order and justice in times of chaos. Even as war raged, the king had to ensure that laws were enforced, internal conflicts were resolved, and society did not crumble under the pressure. This was essential to maintaining social cohesion and loyalty to the throne. Another immense responsibility was the management of the kingdom's resources. War was incredibly expensive. The king needed to ensure that the kingdom could finance the war, whether through taxes, plunder, or, as a last resort, payments of Danegeld. The decision to pay Danegeld, although unpopular, was a royal prerogative and a very high-risk strategic decision that could relieve immediate pressure but impoverish the kingdom. The king was also the symbol of the people's identity and faith. In a war against pagans, the monarch was the defender of Christianity and the moral leader. His piety and devotion could inspire hope and resilience in a terrified population. The legitimacy of his authority was often divine, which reinforced his role as a leader in times of existential crisis. Finally, royalty had a responsibility to protect the lineage and the future of the kingdom. This meant ensuring the continuity of the dynasty, protecting heirs, and making decisions that would ensure the long-term survival of Wessex. The actions of Æthelred and Alfred exemplified this responsibility. Æthelred, by fighting tirelessly, sacrificed his kingdom for the defense of the present, while Alfred, by innovating and planning, secured the future. The role of royalty in times of invasion was therefore one of immense burden, a fusion of military leader, administrator, symbol of faith, and protector of a civilization on the brink of extinction. In Anglo-Saxon culture, the image of the king was not just that of a ruler sitting on a throne, but intrinsically that of a warrior king. This representation, forged through centuries of invasions, conquests, and territorial defenses, was the cornerstone of legitimacy and respect. The crown and the sword were not just separate symbols, They were inseparable, representing the power to govern and the ability to protect the kingdom through military force. From the legendary times of Beowulf to historical kings such as Offa of Mercia and Æthelred of Wessex, bravery on the battlefield was an essential virtue for any Anglo-Saxon monarch. A king was expected to lead his troops personally, to be at the forefront of combat, and to inspire his men by example. The loyalty, comitatus, of thanes, his noble warriors, and the fired, the militia army, was forged in the confidence that their king would not abandon them in danger. A king who fled from battle or showed cowardice lost not only respect, but his very legitimacy. For Æthelred and later Alfred, this expectation was even more pronounced because of the existential nature of the war against the great heathen army. They were not kings in peacetime, but monarchs of a kingdom under siege. Their image as warrior kings was constantly reinforced by their presence in the multiple battles of 871. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other texts emphasize Æthelred's active participation in the combat, and the story of Alfred at Ashdown, leading the charge while his brother was at Mass, only serves to cement this image of a king who is, above all, a warrior. The sword, then, was not just a weapon. It was a sacred symbol of authority and protection. Many Anglo-Saxon kings had legendary swords, and the act of wielding a sword in battle was a statement of leadership. The crown, in turn, represented sovereignty, the divine right to rule, and the responsibility to maintain order and law. Together, the sword and crown embodied the ideal of the king who ruled justly and protected his people fiercely. This representation had profound implications for society. Young Anglo-Saxons were raised on stories of bravery and heroism in battle. Military service was an honor, and death in combat in defense of king and kingdom was seen as a form of martyrdom, or a path to glory. Thangs, they swore loyalty to the king and were rewarded with land and riches for their service, reinforcing the link between royalty and military strength. Even religion reinforced this image. The defense of Christianity against the pagans transformed the warrior king into a champion of God. Prayers before battle, blessings from bishops, and the promise of salvation to those who died fighting were all part of the divine justification of war and royal leadership. In short, the representation of the warrior king in Anglo-Saxon culture was not a mere formality. It was the essence of kingship. Æthelred and Alfred, in their respective reigns, embodied this image to the fullest, living and fighting to defend the last bastion of their culture. Their ability to be both the sword and the crown, the leader who ruled and the warrior who protected, was a crucial factor that allowed Wessex to stand where other kingdoms had fallen, ensuring that the Anglo-Saxon legacy would continue. To the modern observer of English history, the name of Æthelred of Wessex rarely resonates with the same force and recognition as that of his brother, Alfred the Great. Despite his reign and his tireless struggle against the great heathen army, Æthelred's legacy seems to be consigned to forgotten memory, overshadowed by the grandeur of Alfred's achievements. But why this disparity in fame and historical recognition? The answer lies in a combination of historical and narrative factors, and the very nature of their reigns. First, Alfred's comparative success is the most obvious factor. While Æthelred fought a grueling defensive war, dying in the midst of the crisis, Alfred succeeded not only in repelling the Vikings from Wessex, but also in beginning the reconquest of lost territories, in implementing far-reaching social and military reforms, and in laying the foundations for the unification of England. Alfred turned imminent defeat into long-term victory, an achievement that naturally eclipses his brother's reign, which was one of sustained resistance, but not of great conclusive triumphs. Second, the length and outcome of their reigns are crucial. Æthelred reigned for only 6 years, 865–871, a period dominated by a series of bloody battles and the constant danger of annihilation. He died in the midst of war, and his death, though without a clear cause, was not followed by a period of peace or prosperity attributable to his rule. Alfred, on the other hand, reigned for almost 30 years, 871–899, a period of consolidation, innovation, and eventual triumph. Historians and chroniclers tend to focus on those reigns that culminate in great achievements and a happier ending to the narrative. The availability of historical sources also plays a significant role. The main source for the period is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which, although it mentions Æthelred and his battles, is more detailed and flattering towards Alfred. In addition, Alfred had his own biography, The Life of King Alfred, written by Æthelred, a Welsh monk who knew him personally. This work offers a much more in-depth insight into Alfred's personality, actions, and thoughts, solidifying his image as a great king. Æthelred had no such dedicated chronicler. The lack of a detailed, personal account of his reign leaves him at a disadvantage. Another factor is Alfred's charisma and vision. Alfred was not just a warrior, he was a scholar, a lawgiver, and a visionary. His passion for education and culture, his diplomatic skill, and his ability to plan long-term reforms made him a figure of admiration. Æthelred, though courageous and pious, does not seem to have demonstrated the same kind of cultural or reformist vision. He was, in essence, a warrior king of his time, focused on the immediate battle. Finally, the narrative of greatness itself tends to focus on a single hero. It is easier and more impactful for the audience to focus on the figure of Alfred the Great as the savior of England, rather than delving into the nuances of a predecessor who laid the foundations but did not reap the fruits of victory. Æthelred was an essential king, a tireless defender who held the kingdom together and fought to the end. Without his tenacity, Alfred might not have had a kingdom to save. Yet his contribution, though fundamental, was overshadowed by the glory of his brother. The memory of Æthelred, therefore, is that of a forgotten hero, a building block upon which the greatness that would come later was built. The death of King Æthelred in AD 871, albeit under uncertain circumstances, was not merely the end of a reign. It was a crucial watershed that marked the beginning of a new era for Wessex, and, by extension, for the future of England. His death, which occurred at the height of the Viking crisis, paved the way for Alfred's accession to the throne, an event that would, retroactively, prove to be the salvation of the kingdom and the catalyst for profound transformation. Æthelred's reign was one of continuous and desperate resistance. He inherited the threat of the great heathen army and devoted every moment of his rule to fighting it. He was a king who literally died in service, exhausted by war. Yet his death, rather than disintegrating the kingdom, forced a transition of leadership that would prove extraordinarily beneficial. Alfred's accession was not just a change of name on the throne, it was a change in strategic approach. Although the fight against the Vikings remained the priority, Alfred, having fought alongside his brother and witnessed firsthand the weaknesses and strengths of Wessex, was exceptionally prepared for the task that awaited him. His combat experience, combined with his intelligence and far-sightedness, enabled him to implement reforms that Æthelred, perhaps through lack of time or inclination, could not undertake. The first major impact of this new era was the military reorganization. Alfredo understood that the traditional system with its limited length of service, was not suitable for a prolonged war against the Vikings. He implemented a rotation system, dividing the army into two halves that served alternately, allowing farmers to return to their lands. Most importantly, he began the construction and repair of a network of burhs, strategically located fortified towns that served as points of defense and refuge for the population. This network of burhs would become the backbone of Wessex's defense and the basis for future reconquest. In addition, Alfred invested in naval strength, building larger and faster ships designed to combat Viking ships, an effort that Æthelred had not had the opportunity to develop. This innovation was crucial in protecting the coasts of Wessex and intercepting Viking reinforcements. The new era also brought a cultural and educational renaissance. Alfred, a learned king, promoted literacy and the translation of essential Latin works into Old English, seeking to restore the learning that had been decimated by the Viking invasions. He believed that the strength of a kingdom lay not only in its sword, but also in its wisdom and faith. Æthelred's death, then, was the catalyst that allowed Wessex to make this transition. The kingdom, under Alfred's new leadership, not only continued to endure, but began to evolve. Alfred's policies, though initially pragmatic in order to survive, soon evolved into an ambitious vision of a unified Christian England. Æthelred's was an age of sacrifice and desperate defense. Alfred's would be one of innovation, resilience, and, ultimately, the founding of the English nation. The watershed was bloody but essential. Æthelred's death in AD 871 did not bring the war against the great heathen army to an abrupt end. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a new phase of the same struggle, but under a leadership that would indelibly shape the future of Britain. The post-Æthelred era was one of continued warfare, but also of gradual strategic transformation, culminating in the triumphant accession of Alfred the Great and the laying of the foundations of a unified England. In the years immediately following Æthelred's death, the Kingdom of Wessex, now under Alfred's rule, continued to face the Viking threat. The Great Armada, although it had suffered setbacks such as the Battle of Ashdown, was still an overwhelming force and had no intention of leaving the island. Alfred, newly crowned, was forced to deal with the reality of an implacable enemy. After the defeat at Wilton in 871, the pragmatic Alfred opted for a truce and paid a large sum of money to the Vikings, Danegeld. This decision, far from being a sign of surrender, was a clever tactic to gain time, allow Wessex to recover from the exhaustion of the battles, and for the Viking forces to move to other kingdoms, such as Mercia, where they established themselves in Repton. This period of purchased peace was crucial for Alfred. He used the time to initiate military reforms that his brother, Æthelred, had not had the time or opportunity to implement. Fyrd was restructured, and a network of burhs, fortified towns, began to be built or revitalized at strategic locations throughout the kingdom. These fortresses not only served as refuge for the population and defense centers, but also as bases from which Anglo-Saxon forces could launch coordinated counterattacks. The creation of an Anglo-Saxon navy, with larger ships designed to combat the longships Vikings, was another key innovation of Alfred's, aimed at protecting the coasts of Wessex and controlling the sea routes. The war, however, was not over. In 878, the Great Armada, under the leadership of King Guthrum, launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, forcing Alfred to flee to the Athelney marshes, at what was the lowest point of his life, and that of the Kingdom of Wessex. But it was from this refuge that Alfred orchestrated his remarkable recovery, culminating in the decisive Battle of Edington, 878. This crushing victory not only saved Wessex, but also forced Guthrum to accept the Peace of Wedmore, which included Guthrum's conversion to Christianity and the establishment of the Danelaw, a region in eastern England under Viking rule, but with a defined border with Wessex. From Edington and Wedmore onwards, the political landscape of Wessex changed from a struggle for survival to a process of gradual expansion and unification. Alfred not only consolidated control over Wessex, but also began to reconquer parts of Mercia and establish hegemony over other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that were not under Viking rule. He saw himself not just as King of Wessex, but as King of the Anglo-Saxons, a vision that would lay the foundations for the future England. Æthelred's legacy, though less celebrated, was vital in this process. His tireless resistance prevented Wessex from falling before Alfred's accession, keeping the last Anglo-Saxon stronghold intact. The post-Æthelred era, then, was the stage where his brother's Herculean struggle found its resolution, transforming a beleaguered kingdom into the seed of a unified nation. The war did not cease immediately, but the direction had shifted from desperate defense to building a future.